Elijah Anderson had given up hope 3 years ago. His beloved mare Aurora had vanished without a trace during the worst blizzard his Montana ranch had seen in decades. But on this crisp October morning, as golden sunlight painted the mountainous horizon, something impossible was about to happen, something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about loyalty, survival, and the unbreakable bonds between horse and human. If you love incredible stories about the amazing connections between horses and humans, you're going to want to stick around for this one. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing to Horseback Stories. We share the most heartwarming and unbelievable horse tales from around the world. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story that might just restore your faith in the magic of these magnificent animals. The story begins 5 years earlier, when Elijah Anderson was 68 years old and still running the same cattle ranch in the Bitterroot Valley that his grandfather had established in 1923. The Rockingham Ranch sprawled across 800 acres of some of the most beautiful terrain in western Montana, where rolling grasslands met pine-covered foothills and crystal-clear streams meandered through pastures that seemed to stretch endlessly towards snow-capped peaks. Elijah had never married, dedicating his entire life to the land and the animals that called it home. His closest companion wasn't human. It was Aurora, a stunning paint mare with a coat like spilled coffee cream, marked by patches of deep chocolate brown. She had intelligence in her eyes that seemed almost human, and a spirit that could be both gentle and fierce depending on what the situation demanded. Aurora wasn't just any horse. Elijah had raised her from a foal after her mother died from complications during birth. For 13 years, she had been his constant companion, helping him work cattle, navigate treacherous mountain trails, and providing the kind of silent understanding that only comes from a bond forged through thousands of hours together in all kinds of weather and circumstances. But what made Aurora truly special wasn't just her intelligence or her striking appearance. It was her uncanny ability to sense things that others couldn't. She could predict weather changes hours before they arrived, would become restless and protective when predators were near, and seemed to have an almost supernatural connection to the rhythms of the ranch. Elijah often said that Aurora knew the land better than he did, despite the fact that he'd been walking these same trails for 7 decades. The winter that changed everything began earlier than usual. By mid-November, snow was already accumulating in the higher elevations, and the long-range weather forecasts were predicting one of the harshest winters on record. Elijah had been through plenty of difficult seasons, but something about this one felt different. The animals seemed more restless than usual, gathering closer to the barn and shelter areas even before the temperature really dropped. Aurora was especially agitated. She would pace the fence line for hours, staring toward the eastern mountains with an intensity that made Elijah uneasy. When he approached her, she would nicker softly and nuzzle his shoulder, but her attention would quickly return to whatever she sensed in the distance. Elijah checked and double-checked his winter preparations, making sure he had enough hay, that all the fencing was secure, and that the barn was properly insulated. December arrived with a vengeance. The first major storm dumped 3 feet of snow in 2 days, followed by temperatures that didn't rise above zero for more than a week. Elijah's daily routine became a battle against the elements, breaking ice on water troughs, carrying hay to scattered feed stations, and checking on cattle that had sought shelter in the protected valleys. Aurora remained his faithful partner through it all. Together they would ride out each morning, her hooves finding sure footing even in the deepest drifts, her warm breath creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air. Elijah couldn't have managed the ranch without her, and he told her so every day, his gloved hands stroking her neck as they paused to rest during their rounds. The storm that would change everything began building on December 18th. The Weather Service issued blizzard warnings, predicting wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour and snowfall rates of up to 4 inches per hour. Elijah had lived through plenty of blizzards, but the meteorologists were calling this one potentially historic. He spent the day before the storm making final preparations, moving all the horses into the main barn, securing anything that could become projectile in high winds, and laying in extra supplies in case they lost power or couldn't get to town for several days. Aurora seemed even more restless than usual, but Elijah attributed it to the approaching weather. The storm hit with a fury that exceeded even the dire predictions. By noon on December 19th, the wind was howling like a freight train, driving snow horizontally across the landscape with such force that Elijah couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the barn door. The power went out early in the afternoon, and the temperature plummeted to 20 below zero. Elijah settled in for what he knew would be a long night, checking on the horses every few hours by lantern light, making sure their water hadn't frozen, and talking to them in the soothing voice they knew meant safety and comfort. Aurora seemed calmer once the storm was actually upon them, as if the waiting had been harder than the reality. But sometime in the pre-dawn hours of December 20th, something went wrong. Elijah was awakened by a sound he couldn't immediately identify, a rhythmic banging that seemed to be coming from the direction of the barn. He pulled on his boots and winter coat, grabbed a flashlight, and made his way through the howling wind and driving snow toward the sound. What he found when he reached the barn made his heart stop. The main door was standing wide open, banging against the building in the wind. Snow had already drifted several feet into the barn, and the temperature inside was dropping rapidly. But worse than the open door was what Elijah discovered when he counted the horses. Aurora was gone. Elijah's first instinct was to saddle one of the other horses and go looking for Aurora immediately, but even as he reached for a bridle, he knew it would be suicide. The storm was still raging with undiminished fury. The temperature was 25 below zero, and visibility was essentially zero. No horse or human could survive long in those conditions, and Aurora's tracks, if there were any, would have been obliterated within minutes. Instead, Elijah did the only thing he could do. He secured the barn, made sure the remaining horses were warm and safe, and waited for the storm to pass, praying that Aurora had found shelter somewhere and would return when the weather cleared. The blizzard raged for another 36 hours. When it finally ended, it left behind a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Snowdrifts towered 12 feet high in some places, roads were completely impassable, and the familiar contours of the ranch had been erased by an endless expanse of white. Elijah began searching for Aurora the moment conditions allowed. He rode out on Copper, his second most reliable horse, following fence lines and checking every shelter and windbreak within miles of the ranch. He found tracks, lots of them, but the snow was so deep and the drifting had been so severe that it was impossible to tell which ones might have been Aurora's or how old they were. For weeks, Elijah searched. He posted flyers in town, contacted every ranch within a 50-mile radius, and checked with the state wildlife office in case Aurora had been spotted by hunters or hikers. He rode farther from home than he ever had before, exploring remote valleys and hidden canyons where a lost horse might seek shelter. During those long weeks of searching, Elijah began to hear stories from other ranchers and locals that both encouraged and puzzled him. Several people reported seeing a lone paint horse in the mountains, always at a distance, always moving away from human contact. The sightings were scattered across a wide area, from the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness to the remote reaches of the Sapphire Mountains. What struck Elijah as odd was the pattern of the sightings. The horse, if it was Aurora, seemed to be moving in a roughly circular route that covered hundreds of square miles. She wasn't just wandering randomly. She appeared to be following some kind of deliberate path that took her through some of the most remote and challenging terrain in the region. But as winter deepened and the sightings became less frequent, Elijah began to face the devastating possibility that Aurora might not have survived. Montana winters were brutal enough for horses with shelter and regular feeding. For a lone animal in the wilderness, the odds were overwhelming. Spring brought renewed hope and a fresh round of searching. As the snow melted and mountain passes became accessible again, Elijah expanded his search area, sometimes camping out for days at a time as he explored valleys that had been inaccessible during the winter. He found evidence that horses had been in some of these areas, hoofprints in soft ground, places where bark had been stripped from trees, but nothing definitive. The second winter was even harder than the first. Elijah had mostly stopped his active searching, though he still rode out regularly and kept his eyes open for any sign of Aurora. The isolation of the ranch, which had never bothered him before, began to weigh heavily. Without Aurora, the daily routines that had structured his life for more than a decade felt empty and purposeless. What Elijah didn't know was that Aurora had not only survived her first winter in the wilderness, she had thrived. The intelligence and instincts that had made her such an exceptional ranch horse had served her well in the wild. She had found shelter in a network of caves and overhangs in a remote canyon 30 miles from the Rocking M, where natural hot springs kept water from freezing and provided a slightly warmer microclimate. Aurora had also discovered something that would change the course of her story forever. She wasn't alone in the wilderness. A small band of wild horses had been living in the same region for decades, descendants of ranch horses that had escaped or been abandoned during the early days of settlement. They accepted Aurora into their group, and she learned from them the secrets of winter survival in the mountains, where to find grass beneath the snow, how to break ice to reach water, which plants were nutritious and which were dangerous. But Aurora's story was about to take another unexpected turn. In her second spring in the wild, she gave birth to a foal, a stunning little filly, with a coat that seemed to capture both Aurora's gentle cream base and bold dark markings that spoke of wild heritage. Aurora named her daughter Dawn, in the language of gentle nickering and protective nuzzling that horses use to communicate love. Aurora was a devoted mother, teaching Dawn everything she knew about survival while also passing along the gentler lessons she had learned during her years with Elijah. Unlike the other wild horses who were wary of any human presence, Aurora would sometimes lead Dawn to high overlooks where they could see the distant buildings of the Rocking M Ranch. It was as if Aurora was making sure her daughter knew about the other world, the world of humans and domesticated horses, even as they lived wild and free in the mountains. As Dawn grew from a foal into a strong young horse, Aurora began to feel a pull she couldn't ignore. The summer when Dawn turned 2, Aurora started leading the band of wild horses on longer journeys, routes that gradually brought them closer and closer to the edges of civilization. The other horses were nervous about these excursions. They had survived by avoiding human contact, and Aurora's increasing boldness made them uneasy. But Aurora was the unofficial leader of the group. Her intelligence and ranch horse training had made her valuable in ways that went beyond survival skills, and they trusted her judgment even when they didn't understand her motivations. Meanwhile, back at the Rocking M Ranch, Elijah was struggling with decisions he had never imagined having to make. At 71 years old, the daily demands of running a large ranch were becoming more challenging, especially without Aurora's help. His nephew David had been after him to sell the ranch and move to town, arguing that Elijah was too old to be living alone in such an isolated location. Elijah resisted these suggestions with the fierce independence that had characterized his entire life, but privately, he was beginning to acknowledge that some changes might be necessary. The ranch that had been in his family for nearly a century might need to pass to new hands if it was going to survive another generation. But Elijah couldn't bring himself to make any final decisions. Something deep inside him insisted that Aurora's story wasn't over, that somehow, someday, she would find her way home. It was an irrational belief that he couldn't explain to anyone else, but it was as real to him as the sunrise over the eastern peaks. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Elijah was up before dawn, as he had been for 7 decades, beginning his daily routine of checking on the cattle and horses. October had brought the first light frosts of the season, painting the grass with silver and reminding him that winter preparations would need to begin soon. He was walking toward the main corral, coffee mug in hand, when movement on the eastern ridge caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be elk. They often moved through the area during their autumn migration. But something about the silhouettes against the brightening sky made him pause and look more carefully. Elijah set down his coffee mug and walked to the barn to get his binoculars. When he raised them to his eyes and focused on the ridge, his hands began to shake so violently that he could barely hold the glasses steady. There, outlined against the morning sky, were 2 horses. One was larger, clearly an adult, with the distinctive paint markings that Elijah would have recognized anywhere. The other was smaller, younger, moving with the fluid grace of a horse in its prime. Aurora had come home, and she had brought a friend. Elijah lowered the binoculars and rubbed his eyes, certain that his imagination was playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, the horses were still there, now moving slowly down the ridge toward the ranch buildings. Aurora's distinctive gait, A smooth, ground-covering walk that Elijah remembered as clearly as his own heartbeat was unmistakable. As Aurora and the younger horse approached, Elijah could see that the smaller animal was clearly Aurora's offspring. The family resemblance was unmistakable, from the intelligent set of the ears to the proud carriage of the head. But what struck Elijah most powerfully was the way the young horse moved, with the wariness of a wild animal combined with something else, something that suggested trust and curiosity rather than fear. Elijah stood perfectly still, afraid that any sudden movement might spook the horses and send them racing back toward the mountains. Aurora was now close enough that he could see the changes that 3 years in the wild had made. She was leaner than she had been, with muscles hardened by constant movement over rough terrain. Her coat was thicker and more weathered, and there were small scars that spoke of encounters with predators and the harsh realities of wilderness life. But her eyes, those intelligent, knowing eyes that had always seemed to see straight into Elijah's soul, were exactly the same. Aurora approached the fence line where Elijah stood and stopped about 20 feet away. For a long moment, horse and human simply looked at each other, 3 years of separation and worry and wondering compressed into a single moment of recognition and reunion. Then Aurora did something that made Elijah's knees weak with emotion. She nickered, the same soft greeting sound she had made every morning when he came to the barn. It was a sound that said, "I'm home, and I've missed you, and I have something important to show you." The young horse hung back, clearly uncertain about this human who seemed to be so important to her mother. Elijah could see the conflict in her posture, the wild instincts that told her to flee warring with the trust she had in Aurora's judgment. Elijah began to speak, using the same calm, gentle voice he had used with Aurora for 13 years. "Hey there, beautiful girl, I've missed you so much. And who's this handsome young horse you've brought with you?" Aurora began to move closer, each step deliberate and careful. The young horse followed, staying close to her mother's side but gradually relaxing as she sensed that this human posed no threat. When Aurora reached the fence, she extended her neck and touched her nose to Elijah's outstretched hand. The contact sent a shock of emotion through Elijah that was so intense he had to grip the fence rail to keep from falling. Aurora's nose was exactly as he remembered it, soft and warm, with the delicate whiskers that would tickle his palm when she investigated treats in his pocket. "You came back," Elijah whispered, his voice breaking. "I knew you would. I don't know how, but I knew." Aurora seemed to understand that she needed to bridge the gap between her human and her daughter. She began to move back and forth between Elijah and the young horse, nickering to each of them in turn, as if she was making introductions. The young horse, who Elijah began to think of as Dawn because she had appeared with the morning light, watched these interactions with growing curiosity. She could see that her mother trusted this human completely, and gradually her natural wariness began to give way to the same curiosity that had always characterized Aurora. When Dawn finally approached the fence, Elijah felt his heart overflow with a joy he hadn't experienced in years. This beautiful young horse was not just Aurora's daughter. She was a bridge between two worlds, carrying within her the best of both wild freedom and domestic trust. Over the following days, Elijah gradually pieced together the story of Aurora's wilderness years. It became clear that she had not only survived but had become the leader of a small band of wild horses. The skills she had learned as a ranch horse, intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to assess and respond to changing conditions, had made her invaluable in the wild. But Aurora had never forgotten her home or the human who had raised her. Elijah began to understand that her return wasn't random or accidental. She had come back because she wanted to give Dawn a choice. The choice between the wild life that had sustained them both and the domestic life that Aurora remembered with fondness. Dawn was naturally curious about everything on the ranch. Unlike her mother, who remembered these sights and sounds from her earlier life, everything was new and fascinating to Dawn. She was particularly intrigued by the barn, the corrals, and the other horses who lived there full-time. Elijah moved slowly and carefully, allowing both horses to explore at their own pace. He left the gate to the main pasture open, making it clear that Aurora and Dawn were free to leave whenever they chose. This wasn't about capturing or confining them, it was about offering them options. As the days passed, it became apparent that Dawn had inherited much more than just Aurora's appearance. She demonstrated the same keen intelligence, the same ability to assess situations and solve problems. But she also possessed something that was uniquely her own, a combination of wild instincts and gentle curiosity that suggested extraordinary potential. Elijah began to work with both horses, starting with simple exercises that allowed Dawn to become comfortable with human contact. Aurora seemed to encourage these interactions, often positioning herself between Elijah and Dawn in a way that clearly communicated her approval and protection. The breakthrough came when Elijah was working on repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree. Dawn had been watching from a distance, clearly fascinated by the tools and the process. When Elijah accidentally dropped his hammer, Dawn approached cautiously, picked it up in her teeth, and brought it to him. Elijah was stunned. No one had taught Dawn to retrieve objects. She had simply observed, understood what was needed, and acted accordingly. It was a level of intelligence and cooperation that Elijah had rarely seen, even in highly trained horses. Aurora watched this interaction with what Elijah could only describe as pride. It was as if she was saying, "See, I told you she was special." As autumn progressed toward winter, Elijah found himself feeling stronger and more energetic than he had in years. Having Aurora back, and watching Dawn's development, had given him a renewed sense of purpose. The daily routines that had felt burdensome and empty for 3 years suddenly felt meaningful again. But Elijah was also realistic about the future. At 71, he knew that his time as an active rancher was limited. The question that kept him awake at night was what would happen to the ranch and to Aurora and Dawn when he could no longer manage the day-to-day operations. The answer began to emerge when Elijah's nephew David came for his annual visit in November. David had been pressuring Elijah to sell the ranch for years, but when he saw Aurora and Dawn, his entire attitude changed. David's teenage daughter Lisa had been horse crazy her entire life, but had never had the opportunity to work with horses on a ranch. When she met Dawn, the connection was immediate and powerful. Lisa possessed the same gentle patience and intuitive understanding that Elijah had always used with horses, and Dawn responded to her with the same trust she showed toward Elijah. "Dad," Lisa said to David on their last evening at the ranch, "what if we moved here instead of Uncle Elijah moving to town? I could help take care of the horses, and Uncle Elijah could teach me everything he knows about ranching." David looked at his uncle, then at his daughter, then at the 2 horses, who had somehow managed to restore hope and possibility to a situation that had seemed hopeless just months before. Elijah felt tears come to his eyes as he listened to Lisa's suggestion. It was as if Aurora had orchestrated this entire sequence of events, bringing Dawn home at exactly the right moment to capture the heart of a young person who could carry on the traditions and values that the Rocking M Ranch represented. "Lisa," Elijah said carefully, "ranching is hard work. It means getting up before dawn every day, working in all kinds of weather, and taking care of animals no matter how you feel or what else you might want to do." "I know, Uncle Elijah," Lisa replied, "but I also know that Dawn needs someone who understands her. Someone who can help her develop her potential while respecting the wildness that's part of who she is. And Aurora needs to know that her daughter will be safe and loved." Elijah looked at Aurora, who was standing quietly nearby, as if she was listening to every word of this conversation. He had the uncanny feeling that she understood exactly what was being discussed, and that she approved. "David," Elijah said to his nephew, "if you're serious about this, we could work out an arrangement. You could gradually take over the ranch operations while I transition into more of an advisory role. Lisa could learn horsemanship and ranch management, and Aurora and Dawn could have the kind of home where they can be both wild and domestic, free and safe." David looked at his daughter's hopeful face, then at the 2 horses who had somehow managed to solve a problem that had seemed intractable just days before. "I think," David said slowly, "that might be exactly what all of us need." Over the winter months, David and Lisa made regular trips to the ranch, gradually taking on more responsibilities as Elijah taught them the routines and rhythms of ranch life. Lisa's natural ability with horses amazed everyone who watched her work, and her bond with Dawn deepened with each visit. Aurora seemed to approve of these developments. She remained protective of Dawn, but clearly recognized that Lisa was someone who could be trusted with her daughter's welfare. More remarkably, Aurora began to demonstrate behaviors that suggested she was deliberately teaching Dawn how to work with humans. Elijah watched in amazement as Aurora would demonstrate basic ground manners, lead rope techniques, and even simple riding preparations. It was as if she was drawing on her years of ranch training to prepare Dawn for a domestic life while still preserving her wild independence. By spring, the arrangement had evolved into a plan that benefited everyone involved. David would purchase the ranch from Elijah, allowing Elijah to remain in the house he had lived in his entire life while transitioning day-to-day operations to the younger generation. Lisa would spend summers at the ranch and attend a local high school that had an excellent agricultural program. Most importantly, Aurora and Dawn would have a home where they could choose their level of domestication. They were free to roam the mountains when they chose, but they also had the security of barn, pasture, and human care when they needed or wanted it. In late spring, as Lisa was spending her first extended stay at the ranch, Aurora did something that left everyone speechless. She led Dawn to the main barn, positioned her daughter in the center of the grooming area, and then looked directly at Lisa with an expression that clearly communicated, "She's ready. Please take care of her." It was a formal introduction, a passing of responsibility from mother to mentor. Aurora remained nearby, supervising and offering gentle corrections when necessary, but it was clear that she had made a conscious decision to expand Dawn's education to include human partnership. Lisa approached this responsibility with the reverence it deserved. Working with Dawn wasn't just about training a horse, it was about honoring the trust that Aurora had placed in her and continuing a relationship that bridged the gap between wild and domestic freedom and security. Under Lisa's patient guidance, Dawn began to develop skills that combined her natural intelligence with traditional horsemanship training. She learned to lead, to ground tie, to stand quietly for grooming and basic care. But she also retained the wildness that was so much a part of her identity, the ability to read the wind and weather, to sense the presence of wildlife, to move through difficult terrain with the sure-footed confidence of a mountain horse. The test came in Dawn's third summer at the ranch, when a late-season wildfire threatened the entire valley. Emergency crews were evacuating livestock from ranches throughout the area, and David faced the difficult decision of whether to try to transport Aurora and Dawn to safety or trust them to find their own way to security in the mountains they knew so well. Elijah, now 74 but still sharp and decisive in a crisis, had no doubts about what needed to happen. "Let them go," he told David. "Aurora knows this country better than any fire crew, and she'll keep Dawn safe." As evacuation trucks loaded cattle and horses from neighboring ranches, Aurora and Dawn simply melted away into the hills, following routes that only they knew. For 3 days, as the fire raged through thousands of acres of forest and grassland, Elijah worried and prayed and trusted in the intelligence and survival instincts that had kept Aurora alive during her years in the wilderness. When the fire was finally contained and residents were allowed to return to their homes, Elijah and Lisa rode out to search for the 2 horses. They found them in a high meadow that the fire had never reached, grazing peacefully alongside a small band of wild horses that had also survived the blaze. Aurora and Dawn were healthy, unharmed, and ready to return home. They had passed the ultimate test, proving that they could survive anything nature might throw at them, while still choosing to make the ranch their primary home. As Lisa grew into adulthood and took on greater responsibility for the ranch, she began to develop programs that honored the lessons Aurora and Dawn had taught about the relationship between wild and domestic horses. The Rocking M became a sanctuary for horses that needed a place to transition between domesticated and wild life, and a training center where young people could learn horsemanship skills that respected both the intelligence and the wildness of these magnificent animals. Elijah, now in his early 70s, found his greatest joy in watching Lisa work with Dawn and the other horses that came to the ranch. Dawn had grown into a magnificent mare, equally comfortable leading trail rides through mountain wilderness and working cattle in the home pastures. She had inherited Aurora's intelligence and added her own unique blend of wildness and gentleness. Aurora, now in her early 20s, had earned the status of elder stateswoman among the ranch horses. She no longer worked regularly, but her wisdom and experience made her invaluable as a teacher and guide for younger horses. She had proven that the bond between horse and human could survive years of separation and be strong enough to build a bridge between two very different worlds. Lisa, now 25 and the primary manager of the Rocking M Ranch, often stood in the main pasture watching Aurora and Dawn graze together in the evening light. She understood that she had been chosen for her role as surely as Dawn had been prepared for hers. The ranch would continue into another generation, not because of human planning alone, but because of the wisdom and foresight of a paint mare who had never forgotten where she belonged. Elijah, approaching his 80th birthday, knew that his time as an active rancher was nearly over, but he also knew that the legacy of the Rocking M Ranch was secure in the hands of people and horses, who understood that the best partnerships are built on mutual respect, trust, and the kind of love that can survive any separation. Today, the Rocking M Ranch serves as a model for other operations throughout the West, demonstrating that it's possible to honor both the domestic and wild nature of horses, while building sustainable partnerships between humans and animals. The training methods developed by Lisa, based on the lessons learned from Aurora and Dawn, have been adopted by horse enthusiasts across the country. Dawn, now a mother herself, continues the cycle that Aurora began. Her foals carry the genes of both domestic and wild horses, along with an intelligence and adaptability that makes them exceptional partners for humans who understand their unique nature. Each new generation of horses at the Rocking M proves that the boundary between wild and domestic isn't fixed. It's a spectrum that can be navigated with wisdom, patience, and respect. Aurora, now in her mid-20s, spends her days doing what she has always done best, watching over her family, both human and equine, and serving as a living reminder that love and loyalty can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. She has proven that horses are capable of planning, hoping, and making sacrifices for the good of others. Elijah still rides out occasionally, though now it's usually Lisa who handles the daily work of the ranch. When he does saddle up, it's often Aurora who chooses to carry him, as if she knows that their partnership, forged decades ago and tested by years of separation, remains one of the most important relationships in both of their lives. The story of Aurora and Elijah has been told and retold throughout the ranching community of western Montana, becoming a legend that parents share with their children and that horsemen reference when they want to illustrate the extraordinary bonds that can exist between humans and horses. It has inspired countless people to look more carefully at their own relationships with animals, to consider the intelligence and emotional complexity of creatures that are too often underestimated. But perhaps the most important lesson of Aurora's story is this: love doesn't end when physical presence ends. Aurora carried her love for Elijah through 3 years of wilderness survival, through the challenge of raising a foal in harsh conditions, through the decision to return to a world she had left behind. That love shaped every choice she made and ultimately created a future that none of them could have imagined when she first disappeared into that December blizzard. The Rocking M Ranch continues to thrive today, home to horses that represent every point on the spectrum between wild and domestic, cared for by people who understand that the best partnerships are built on freedom, respect, and the kind of trust that allows each individual, human or horse, to be their authentic self. And on clear October mornings, when the light paints the eastern mountains in shades of gold and the air carries the promise of changing seasons, Elijah Anderson still stands by the fence line where Aurora first returned to him, remembering the moment when hope became reality and impossible became inevitable. Aurora's story proves that some bonds are strong enough to survive any test, smart enough to solve any problem, and deep enough to create miracles that restore faith in the magic of connection between species. Her legacy lives on in every horse and human who chooses trust over fear, partnership over dominance, and love over control. It's a legacy that will continue for as long as there are people who believe that the relationship between humans and horses is one of the most profound and transformative partnerships on Earth. And it all began with an elderly rancher who never stopped believing that his beloved mare would find her way home. If Aurora's incredible journey back home touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with fellow horse lovers who believe in the unbreakable bonds between horses and humans. Subscribe for more amazing tales of courage, loyalty, and the extraordinary intelligence of these magnificent animals. Until next time, remember that love has a way of finding its way home, no matter how far it has to travel.